The 4th of July, 1776. In a crowded room in Philadelphia, 56 men signed their names to a single piece of paper, and in doing so signed their own death warrants should they fail. These are the opening words of a rebellion that will tear an empire apart. At stake is not just independence, but an idea that governments derive their power not from kings, but from the consent of the governed. The theory will be tested by musket fire, by starvation, by betrayal, and by a war that few believed the rebels could win. By year's end, a ragged army will be reduced to a few thousand starving men, many marching barefoot through the snow, leaving bloody footprints behind them. British warships will fill New York Harbor in a fleet larger than any seen in the Americas before. An empire's full weight will bear down on a rebellion that most European observers expect to be crushed within months. Yet from the depths of defeat will come one of the most audacious victories in military history, a desperate crossing of an ice-choked river on Christmas night that will save a revolution on the brink of collapse. This is the story of 1776, the year a scattered collection of colonies gambled everything on a single, dangerous idea, and the year America was born in blood, ink, and desperate hope. By the start of 1776, the 13 American colonies have been at war with Britain for 9 months. Fighting broke out the previous April at Lexington and Concord, when British troops marched to seize rebel weapons and were met by colonial militia. Since then, a siege has gripped Boston, where George Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, commands a newly formed Continental Army. Most colonists do not yet want full independence. Many still see themselves as loyal subjects of King George III, wronged by an overreaching parliament. But events are moving quickly, and opinion is shifting. The 13 colonies are not a unified nation, but a patchwork of separate societies, each with its own government, economy, and often conflicting interests, from the merchant ports of New England to the plantation society of the South. They share a common language, and, largely, a common legal tradition inherited from Britain, but little else binds them together beyond a growing sense of shared grievance. Parliament's taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and finally the punitive, intolerable acts imposed after the Boston Tea Party, have convinced many colonists that their rights as Englishmen are being systematically stripped away. Still, declaring full independence from the most powerful empire on earth is an entirely different proposition from resisting unjust taxation. To many, it seems reckless, even suicidal. Congress itself remains divided. Moderates like John Dickinson still hope for reconciliation with the Crown. Radicals like Samuel Adams and John Hancock believe reconciliation is no longer possible. In January, a pamphlet appears on the streets of Philadelphia that will change everything. The argument for independence, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, is unlike anything colonists have read before. Written in plain, forceful language rather than the formal prose of the elite, it argues that monarchy itself is an absurdity, that it is unnatural for an island to rule a continent. Paine writes that the case for independence is not radical, but obvious. Common sense. The pamphlet sells more than 100,000 copies within months, an extraordinary number for a population of roughly 2.5 million free colonists. It is read aloud in taverns, printed in newspapers, and passed hand to hand until the paper wears thin. Paine, an Englishman who arrived in America barely a year earlier, has no patience for the deference many colonists still show toward the king. He calls George III the royal brood of Britain and argues that hereditary succession is no more sensible than hereditary mathematicians or poets. He also makes a practical case that America, with its resources and population, needs Britain far less than Britain needs America, and that reconciliation would only guarantee future conflict. For the first time, independence moves from a fringe position to the mainstream of colonial political thought. Newspapers that once printed only local news now debate Paine's arguments on their front pages. Public opinion begins to tip decisively toward separation. Meanwhile, in Boston, Washington finally has the artillery he needs. The siege of Boston ends through the brutal winter. Continental soldiers under General Henry Knox haul more than 60 heavy cannon, nearly 300 miles from captured Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, using ox-drawn sledges over frozen roads and icy rivers. It is one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the entire war. Knox, a self-taught former bookseller with no formal military engineering training, has been handed a task many consider impossible, transporting artillery weighing as much as 5,500 pounds each across frozen lakes, mountain passes, and half-frozen rivers, in the depths of a New England winter. His convoy includes 43 cannon, 14 mortars, and 2 howitzers, an arsenal of 60 guns in total, hauled by 80 yoke of oxen over roughly 300 miles of the worst possible terrain. Remarkably, not a single gun is lost along the way, though several sledges break through thin ice and must be hauled out by desperate, freezing soldiers on the night of March 4th, under cover of darkness and muffled wheels wrapped in straw. Washington's men dragged the guns onto Dorchester Heights, overlooking the British-held city and harbor. Working through the night, they construct fortified emplacements using prefabricated wooden frames known as chandeliers, filled with bundled sticks called fascines, a technique that allows them to build defensive works on frozen ground far faster than digging alone would allow. By morning, the British commander, General William Howe, finds his fleet and garrison staring down the barrels of American artillery, positioned on high ground that renders both the harbor and the city itself indefensible. With his position untenable, Howe makes the only rational choice: evacuation. On March 17th, nearly 9,000 British troops and 1,000 Loyalists board ships and sail for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Boston is free. For the first time, the Continental Army has forced a British army to retreat without a shot fired in the final confrontation. But Washington knows this victory is only the beginning. He suspects correctly that the next British blow will fall on New York. The Declaration while armies maneuver. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia debates a question that can no longer be avoided. Should the colonies declare independence outright? On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduces a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress appoints a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration explaining the colony's reasoning to the world. The committee includes Jefferson, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. A deliberate mix of regions meant to demonstrate colonial unity. Adams later insists that Jefferson, not himself, should write the draft, reasoning that Jefferson has a gift for writing that he himself lacks, and that a Virginian's name at the head of the document will carry more weight than a New Englander's. The task of writing falls chiefly to the 33-year-old Virginia lawyer, working largely alone in a rented room on the second floor of a bricklayer's house on Market Street. Jefferson drafts a document grounded in Enlightenment philosophy, drawing heavily on ideas from the English philosopher John Locke about natural rights and the social contract between government and the governed. He writes the words that will echo for centuries, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The draft is revised by committee, then debated fiercely on the floor of Congress. Nearly a quarter of the text is cut, including a passage condemning the slave trade, struck out under pressure from Southern delegates and Northern merchants alike, a compromise whose consequences will haunt the nation for generations. On July 2nd, Congress votes for independence. John Adams predicts this date will be celebrated by future generations as America's true birthday. He is off by 2 days. On July 4th, 1776, Congress formally adopts the Declaration of Independence. Copies are rushed by courier and printing press to every colony, read aloud in town squares to cheering, and in some places terrified crowds. In New York, soldiers and citizens topple a gilded statue of King George III, later melting it down for musket balls. The words are printed, but the war to make them real has barely begun, and it is about to go catastrophically wrong. Disaster in New York. Even as the Declaration is read in Philadelphia, the largest expeditionary force the British Empire has ever assembled is gathering off the coast of New York. More than 32,000 British and Hessian mercenary troops, carried by over 400 ships, anchor in New York Harbor, a force larger than the population of Philadelphia itself. The Royal Navy alone brings more firepower to New York Harbor than exists in the entire city of Philadelphia, dozens of warships bristling with cannon, capable of leveling any fixed American position along the coast. Washington has perhaps 19,000 men, most untrained militia rather than professional soldiers, poorly equipped, short on gunpowder, and scattered across a difficult, indefensible terrain of islands and waterways that the Royal Navy can exploit at will. He has also, by his own later admission, made a serious strategic error, dividing his limited forces between Manhattan and Brooklyn Heights on Long Island, rather than concentrating them or withdrawing entirely from a position the Navy can outflank. On August 27th, the British attack at the Battle of Long Island. General Howe executes a brilliant flanking maneuver through the poorly guarded Jamaica Pass on the American left, a route left almost undefended, marching some 10,000 troops through the night to strike the unsuspecting American rear at dawn. The Continental Army is routed. Nearly 2,000 Americans are killed, wounded, or captured in a single day, the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War, and a defeat so total it could have ended the rebellion then and there. Only a daring night evacuation across the East River saves the remnants of Washington's army from annihilation. Over the course of a single night, roughly 9,000 soldiers, along with horses, cannon, and supplies, are ferried silently across the water in small boats, oars muffled with cloth to avoid detection. As dawn breaks and the evacuation is still incomplete, a dense providential fog rolls in off the river, concealing the final boatloads of soldiers from British lookouts stationed less than half a mile away. Washington himself is reportedly among the last men to leave. Had the British discovered the retreat even hours earlier, the Continental Army, and quite possibly the Revolution itself, could have ended on the shores of Brooklyn that August morning. Through September and November, the disasters continue. New York City falls on September 15th and will remain under British occupation for the rest of the war, nearly 7 years. Fort Washington, on the northern tip of Manhattan, is captured on November 16th, along with nearly 3,000 American soldiers and vast stores of desperately needed weapons, ammunition, and supplies, the single worst American defeat of the entire war, in terms of prisoners lost. Washington's army, bleeding men to death, disease, and expiring enlistments, retreats across New Jersey in the depths of a brutal winter. By December, what remains of the Continental Army numbers barely 3,000 ragged, starving men, many without shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. British and Hessian forces occupy New Jersey. Loyalist sentiment surges. Members of Congress flee Philadelphia, fearing capture. Thomas Paine, marching with the retreating army, writes the words that will become legend. These are the times that try men's souls. The revolution stands on the edge of collapse. The Crossing Washington understands that without a dramatic victory, the Continental Army, and the cause of independence itself, will simply dissolve when enlistments expire on December 31st. He conceives an audacious plan, a surprise night crossing of the ice-choked Delaware River to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The password chosen for the operation is grimly fitting: victory or death, on the night of December 25, 1776, Christmas night. Chosen deliberately because Hessian troops are expected to be relaxed and celebrating. Roughly 2,400 soldiers begin crossing the freezing Delaware River in flat-bottomed Durham boats, battling sleet, howling wind, and dangerous, grinding ice floes that threaten to capsize the overloaded vessels. The boats are guided by Colonel John Glover's regiment of Massachusetts mariners, fishermen and sailors whose experience with small craft in rough water proves essential to the operation's success. Horses and 18 pieces of artillery must also be ferried across on separate, larger flat boats, a logistical challenge that consumes far more time than Washington's planners anticipated. The crossing takes far longer than planned, stretching 9 hours instead of the intended few. 2 other American columns scheduled to cross the river at different points, meant to support the main assault, are turned back entirely by the punishing ice and weather. Washington's force will attack Trenton alone, hours behind schedule, in broad daylight rather than under cover of darkness as originally intended. Yet on the morning of December 26th, the Americans achieve complete surprise. The Hessian garrison, still recovering from Christmas celebrations, is overwhelmed in less than an hour. Roughly 900 Hessians are killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties are almost non-existent. It is a small battle by the scale of the war, but its psychological impact is immense. News of Trenton spreads through the colonies like wildfire. Enlistments are extended. Recruits stream back to the army. Confidence, all but extinguished weeks earlier, is reignited. A week later, Washington strikes again at Princeton, outmaneuvering a British force sent to crush him and securing another improbable victory. Arms of the Revolution warfare in 1776 is dominated by the smooth-bore flintlock musket, a weapon largely unchanged in basic design for nearly a century. The British Army's standard weapon is the land-pattern musket, nicknamed the Brown Bess, roughly 5 feet long, firing a lead ball nearly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, effective at little more than 50 to 100 yards, but devastating when fired in massed volleys by disciplined ranks. A well-trained British regular can load and fire 3 shots per minute. American militia, by contrast, are often lucky to manage 1 or 2, and many carry a mismatched assortment of privately owned hunting muskets and fowling pieces rather than standardized military arms. Where American forces sometimes hold an edge is in the rifle, a slower loading but far more accurate weapon favored by frontier riflemen from Pennsylvania and Virginia, capable of hitting targets at 200 yards or more, though useless for the bayonet charges that often decide close engagements. Artillery remains, as in European wars of the era, a decisive arm on the battlefield. Field guns firing solid iron shot can shatter formations at a distance, while grape shot and canister, essentially giant shotgun blasts, turn cannon into terrifying anti-personnel weapons at close range. The Continental Army, chronically short of gunpowder, cannon, and even shoes and blankets, relies heavily throughout the war on captured British supplies and increasingly on covert French assistance, muskets, powder, and money smuggled through Caribbean ports even before France formally enters the war in 1778. Above all, the war in 1776 is a lesson in the gap between a professional European army and a hastily assembled citizen force, a gap that Washington and his officers, including the Prussian-trained Baron von Steuben in later years, will spend the rest of the war working to close. Aftermath and significance. By the close of 1776, the war is far from won. 7 more years of fighting, hardship, and sacrifice lie ahead before the Treaty of Paris finally secures American independence in 1783. But the events of this single year forge the foundation on which everything else is built. The Declaration of Independence transforms a colonial rebellion into a war for a new nation, articulating a philosophy of government that will inspire revolutions across the world for centuries to come. The near catastrophe in New York proves that the Continental Army cannot win through conventional battle against the world's foremost military power, forcing Washington toward the strategy of attrition and endurance that will ultimately wear Britain down. And the victory at Trenton proves something just as vital, that the cause is not lost, that the war can be won, and that this ragged, half-starved army can still strike a blow that matters. Historians still debate what might have happened had Washington not crossed the Delaware that Christmas night. Many argue the revolution could well have collapsed within weeks. The events of 1776 also send ripples far beyond America's shores. In the courts of Europe, and especially in France, Britain's great rival, the rebellion is watched with fascination and calculation. French ministers see an opportunity to weaken their old enemy, and covert aid begins flowing to the Americans even before any formal alliance is signed. Within the colonies themselves, the War of 1776 exposes deep and lasting divisions that independence alone cannot resolve. Loyalists, colonists who remain faithful to the crown, number perhaps a fifth of the population, and the conflict often takes on the character of a civil war, neighbor against neighbor, as much as a war against a foreign power. Enslaved people watched the unfolding revolution with their own calculations. Some, promised freedom by the British in exchange for service against their masters, escaped to British lines. Others serve in the Continental Army itself, hoping the language of liberty might one day extend to them as well. Today, the Declaration's words that all men are created equal remain both a founding promise and an unfinished project invoked in every subsequent struggle for civil rights and equality in American history. From abolition to suffrage to the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Did you know that Thomas Jefferson owned more than 600 enslaved people over his lifetime, even as he wrote the words that all men are created equal? This glaring contradiction was recognized even by some of his contemporaries, and it would take nearly a century and a devastating civil war before the promise of those words began to extend to all Americans. It's a reminder that founding ideals and lived reality don't always align, a tension that echoes through history in surprising ways. Much like how the tools we build for convenience can carry hidden risks of their own. Closing. More than 2 centuries later, the events of 1776 remain woven into the identity of a nation, commemorated every 4th of July with fireworks, parades, and readings of the very documents signed that summer in Philadelphia. The battlefields of Trenton and Princeton are now quiet parks and monuments, a world away from the desperate, freezing soldiers who once fought there for a cause many believed already lost. Independence Hall still stands, preserved as a shrine to the moment 56 men risked everything on the strength of an idea. No single year did more to determine whether that idea would live or die than 1776, a year that began with a pamphlet and ended with a nation still improbably alive.